we define the wealthy countries as the G20 nations, which are like the richest 20 nations. And thus, when we're saying that they should occur in the wealthy nations, we do not mean like just America or those nations' test sites or by those companies, but within those actual nations and their populations, which is going to make sense as we get through our speech. Just a little bit of an observation. We want to establish that just because wealthy nations have more access to drugs and more access to things like vaccines doesn't mean that we are more deserving, and does not mean that the poor nations should be denied the access. All nations should have access, but that is a separate issue from this motion. So we are not talking about just giving it to them, but we're talking about running the testing in those nations, which causes very serious issues. Our framework is going to be minimizing structural violence. So the reason our justifications is first that debate should deal with real world consequences, and ideal theories ignore the concrete nature of the world and legitimate oppression. Curry 14 explains that despite the pronouncement of debate as an activity and intellectual exercise pointing to the real world consequences of dialogue, thinking, and personal politics when addressing issues of racism, sexism, economic disparity, global conflicts, and death. At the most general level, the conceptual chasm between what emerges as actual problems in the world and how we frame such problems theoretically, the assumptions and shared ideologies we depend upon for our problems to be heard and accepted as a worthy problem by an audience, is the most obvious call for an anti-ethical paradigm. Furthermore, resisting structural oppression has to come first. WISO 8 explains that until the voices of economically and racially marginalized persons are given equal weight in debate with rounds of affluent the ideas that shape our world will continue to be those of the elite, no matter how destructive the ideas have been for the vast majority of the planet's inhabitants. Until debate is substantially diversified, ignored voices will have a chance to be heard, will not have the chances to be heard in their own terms and their own styles. Furthermore, we want to slow down the rate at which blood is spilled across the globe, and we desperately need to listen to those who live without the luxury of blinders. So thus, we want to make sure that those who are not given adequate representation and adequate concern, potentially, and especially in global political issues, are given a fair chance. Our first contention is that these trials, when they're not done in the wealthy nations, are exploitive towards the countries in which they are often done in, especially because it has been an increasing trend that wealthy nations, such as the US, will conduct clinical trials in countries that are known as developing nations or underprivileged nations, and those countries will often not have access to those drugs once they're tested on them, leaving their populations with harmful effects. So this is very heavily empirically established, since the dangers of actual clinical trials are very real. The history of clinical trials and their subsequent globalization can be traced back to the thalidomide scandal in Germany, where many children were born with severe deformations of their extremities. It subsequently became clear that thalidomide, a sedative developed by German companies, caused birth defects in babies whose mothers had been taken during pregnancy. However, obviously, whenever the clinical trials occur, there's a risk that there will be some adverse health effect. However, there's kind of a trade-off. You take the risk of, in a population, that there will be a health effect for the potential that it will benefit your country by having access to the drug. However, when it's done in countries that may not have access to the drug, it's an exploitive trade-off that is completely unreasonable. This is explained, and that was from the EMBO reports written by Katrin Wegman. So, furthermore, the LMC or the LMI. Wegman continues that, quote, however, it is precisely this unmet need for the unmet medical need that poses a risk for exploitation. You want to make sure that you don't take advantage of deprivation, and that you don't see the world as a convenient population of sick people where you can go and get the data that you need to make more robust health systems in high-income countries. That part was written by Professor John London, professor of philosophy and the director of the Center of Ethics and Policy at Carnegie Mellon. He continues that indeed human subject researchers in the LMIC, which is low to middle income countries, have often been criticized for exporting the risk of research to those who will in the end not be able to afford the resulting medical products. Clinical trials can pose health risks to participants, and the safety and side effects of these drugs or vaccines being tested are not yet fully known. Furthermore, in many cases, therefore, studying local health needs will not necessarily generate immediate benefits for the poor communities and will often result in exploitation. For instance, it's reported in this report from the Center of the Center for Ethics and Policy at Carnegie Mellon that only 8% of low-income countries are able to receive the products that are tested there, which is incredibly disparaging, it's clearly disheartening that they go through all the suffering of this trial, they take the risk for wealthier countries, and yet they don't reap the rewards. One recent trial in India also evaluated an experimental vaccine preventing a common, potentially life-threatening viral infection called rotavirus. Despite the availability of 2 vaccines that have been proven to be highly effective in preventing serious rotavirus infections in infants and young children, more than 2,000 children in India received placebo injections of salt water rather than one of the available vaccines. Basically, this explains that it's more important for us to get accurate data that can be useful there rather than giving the actual real vaccines that can save children's lives in developing countries such as India, which is something that we actually strongly deplore and want to address as seriously and immediately as possible. And this is not an isolated instance. The FDA found that 57 clinical trials that had classified research sites for official action indicated despite realized that there was protocol violation in 74% of instances. And this is essentially something that we can just not allow. The lack of oversight in other countries is a huge issue, and it makes the ethical violations even more likely and essentially guaranteed. Our second contention is different and abusive rules in foreign countries. Professor of social and preventive medicine at University of Montreal said that the conduct of clinical drug trials in developing countries raises a host of ethical and practical challenges. The notable concerns the ability to obtain valid informed consent and the scientific validity of clinical studies conducted in contexts that lack appropriate regulation and government mechanisms. Furthermore, there's a lack of respect to the participants' right to withdraw from clinical trials when they're abroad. Furthermore, the FDA allows the submission of clinical trial data in the NDA set without submitting essentially important reports, meaning when it's in other countries, which allows reports to not have nearly the same level of oversight in foreign developing countries as they do in America, in America in this instance, which is a massive issue and leads to all those abusive trials that I talked about earlier. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? All right, awesome. And in terms of POIs, if you want to just raise your hand, I'll see ya. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a quick off-time roadmap. In my speech, I'm first just going to go over the definitions, the framework for this round, and then I am going to run through the our opposition case, and then I'm going to rebut the government case. All right, so with all of that, I will start my time now. Hello, judges. My name is Lola Owed. I go by she, her pronouns, and I'm proud to negate the motion that this House believes that clinical trials for drugs/vaccines that are expected to be primarily used in wealthy countries should occur in wealthy countries. The government did not provide us a house in this round, so we're going to define it. We're defining it as a rational individual. All right, and then we agree with their, let's see, so with their definitions, they were talking, they defined it as like not test, how they're going to test in the other nations, blah, 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 that's self-explanatory. But then they make a note at the beginning, an observation about how they're not saying that these nations should not have access to drugs, right? However, what I'm going to point out on our side is that the government isn't giving us any alternative way for them, for the people in these lower income nations to have this access to healthcare, right? So even though they're saying that they want everyone to have access, the only thing that they're doing on their side, as I will prove to you, is taking away some of this access. All right, and then they give this framework. However, we do not give with their framework because ethics are subjective, right? So they're talking about this idea of like a debate chasm and talking about shared ideologies and working underneath an anti-ethical framework. However, I'll get into this more on our side later, but we're going to talk about the idea of like when we're looking at moral philosophies in the first place, are they derived from Western values or are they derived from like Eastern countries, right? So how is the government in this case actually beginning to promote like favoring wealthier countries' ideologies and moralities in the first place, which is inherently going against what they are claiming they are prioritizing in this round. All right. So now let's run through our case. All right, so let's start off with an observation, right? We're not saying that we are exclusively doing trials abroad, right? We're just saying that we're not cutting off the possibility of that, right? The rational individual who's analyzing this round is saying we shouldn't necessarily never have a trial abroad, right? Just that observation. Now let's jump into our contentions. So our first contention is about how this does benefit patients in low and middle income countries, right? So in low and middle income nations, the access to healthcare is sparse, right? So and there's also huge economic displacement and financial struggling that occurs in these areas, right? So oftentimes people in those countries will be faced with the opportunity or the option to go into these clinical trials, right? We'll talk about the ethics of informed consent later, but the thing is, this is still offering a financial opportunity and an opportunity to access healthcare that people may not otherwise be able to access, right? On side government, they're telling us that after these trials, they may not be able to afford that treatment anymore. However, that means that in this, like right now at the beginning, they do not have any access to it, but through the clinical trials, they'll be able to gain some access. All right, so as I'm saying here, clinical trials and the research that healthcare is doing that accompany them can directly benefit these patients, in particular those who otherwise would have no or little access to healthcare services. All right, so now jumping into our second contention, this is about helping build local healthcare infrastructure. So beyond the obvious and direct public health benefits in terms of both new knowledge and new treatments, clinical research also helps to build research and healthcare capacity and can improve local infrastructure and boost the economy, right? So in fact, many developing nations have been actively trying to attract clinical research for these reasons. Once these countries that have like troubled healthcare infrastructures can actually be benefited by these trials. All right, so now let's just jump into our third contention here. If we're looking at this, the contention tagline is effectiveness of trials. So from the perspective of those conducting the trials, a major benefit of doing these trials in low and middle income countries is that it's easier to enroll patients who are willing to participate, particularly if they poor, right? So on the government side, we hear a lot about exploitation, a lot about ethics. I'm going to get into that more later, but just stick with me right now underneath this contention, right? So on our side, there's a much larger willing population. There's a much larger percent of the population that is in poverty and who needs access to healthcare. So there's a larger sample size of people with rare diseases, which means that there's more accurate testing and therefore more lives saved overall. So now let's get into our fourth and final contention that is also, in my opinion, the most important. It's about the question of morality. In this, I'm going to be discussing some of the research that Sandra Alfano, who's a scientist at Yale University of Medicine and is the chair of Yale's Institutional Review Board, has done. All right, so not all ethical principles have cross-cultural validity. This is also in terms of their framework, right? So what we're seeing here is that informed consent is a central concept for any research of human subjects, right? That's what people think. That's what government is giving us in this round, right? However, as was marked in this Yale study, the principle of informed consent flows out of a Western philosophy of individual autonomy that does not always translate well to other countries, right? And Eastern philosophy, as this Yale person explains, may rather rely on community or family decision, right? Individualism is not a universally embraced idea, right? So that's why this is so important to focus on this in this round. The government is giving us all these arguments about morality and ethics and all those things. However, they're operating underneath this Western framework of informed consent, right? Which is not necessarily what is most prevalent in these other countries. So if we're trying to actually allow for like the expansion of these cultures and actually respect these cultures, we should not be going through this round focusing on a Western philosophy of morality. All right. And then in addition, despite cultural differences and the need to collaborate with local communities, we also see that there are guidelines for conducting research in international settings, notably the Declaration of Helsinki by the World Medical Association and the International Guidelines for Biomedical Research Involving Human Subjects by the International Organizations for Medical Sciences, right? So what we see here is that many countries refer to the DOH in their legislation, but what is most important is that it is a document written by physicians for physicians, right? And there is this moral obligation that physicians have, and they do stick to these rules. So what we're seeing here is, yes, there is this moral philosophy that is given like in the Western world that many doctors do continue to operate underneath. But then in general, we do need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to operate underneath this Western philosophy when we're talking about countries that are not necessarily in the same cultural frame? All right, so now their first contention is about not having access to drugs once being tested, leaving harmful results. All right, so I'm gonna cross-reference my contentions to this about like how we're building up infrastructure and boosting the economies in these countries, right? But then in addition, even if you don't buy that we'll be able to help the infrastructure there, still on-site government, these people have zero access. However, on-site opposition, there is an opportunity for access. All right, and then in addition, throughout this entire contention, they keep talking about exploitation, right? And the possibility for it, right? As I pointed out, underneath our idea of looking outside of a Western framework, we need to make sure that we are not applying these like very Eurocentric ideas of individualism. Okay, and then also everything about health risks with side effects unknown, this is non-unique because either in both of these worlds, we're conducting these trials, right? And somebody is being posed with this health risk. All right, in addition, they have their second contention about raising ethical challenges to obtain consent. But as I just pointed out, the whole concept of informed consent is Western. I pointed this all out throughout my side. So for all of those reasons, I strongly urge to stick with an opposition ballot in this round. Thank you.
Okay. If everyone is good to go. Yes. Okay. First of all, a bit of an off-time roadmap. So first, I'm going to be going into how they addressed our case and then back to theirs. Okay. So my time will start now. So first of all, in terms of definitions, we're able to accept their definition of this house meaning rational individuals. Judges, we, as rational individuals yourselves, highly encourage you all to think this through as well. So in terms of the refutations through our case, they really only give very brief refutations, whereas we went through pretty specific evidence of the negative effects of clinical trials, yet the opposition just kind of consistently ignores the evidence that we provide. In response to our first contention, they talk about how this will build healthcare infrastructure. But once again, I would really like to repeat that even though this motion is in relation to healthcare, a government world is not, it's not really saying that it agrees that it is an issue that there's a lack of vaccines in poor nations and that there's a lack of healthcare infrastructure. However, under this motion, that is not really the focus here. It's a lot more about like who is going to be using the vaccines and where they're going to be tested. And so, well, yes, it is an issue that there's lack of vaccines in low-income countries. This is more about the exploitation of these nations and how these clinical trials are being used for vaccines that are at the expense of low-income lives. Furthermore, they talk about financial opportunity and healthcare access. But once again, the opposition here is really weighing wealthy lives over poor lives when they say that they're more willing to put these low-income people in low-income countries' lives at risk. We gave repeated examples of how deregulation in these nations has led to, for example, in terms of the rotavirus in India, giving infants salt water instead of actual vaccines that, and in turn, kind of dooming them to negative outcomes, dooming them to poor health. And so, yes, they're claiming that there's going to be this increase in healthcare. The thing is, what the nature of a clinical trial is that it's not guaranteed that the vaccine is effective. And even so, sometimes these medications, like in the Germany case that we brought up in our first contention, can actually really harm people. You're not only letting the placebo people sorry, I'll take your POI after this point. Not only letting those placebo people go untreated, but sometimes these medications can actually have like really tremendously negative impacts. Like those pregnant women's children were born with malformed limbs and were bound to their bound to wheelchairs for the rest of their lives. Go ahead.
Does anybody face the harms of clinical trial health risks on your side of the debate?
Okay, well, we agree. Like, yes, these trials are still happening, so yes, there is still that risk. But if you are saying that, well, these risks happening is not as bad in a world where those risks are being taken by the wealthy nations that are actually going to benefit from these vaccines, I think that is once again saying that while wealthy lives are more valuable than poor lives. And furthermore, on the matter of our second contention, as we have said, 8% of nations, that big number of 8% of nations are unable, are not actually being able to have these benefits. I believe that's stat. I will correct myself if that is untrue. And they continue to talk about this Eurocentric idea of individualism and that our side is furthering Western values. The thing is, it is not a Western philosophy to value human life. And so, but furthermore, our framework is not based on individualism. Killing people and causing deformities is not Eurocentric. And so this extends all of our evidence that this is still an issue. This is not a Western-centric worldview that's driving this case here. It's a matter of respect for human life. Anyways, moving on to their case. So, first of all, they talk about how their first contention is in regards to benefits to low-income countries. And once again, I'm going over this point again and again because I think a lot of our contentions are really kind of in reference to each other. And so I will be repeating this again. The issue is not about lack of vaccines in poor nations. It's about weighing lives here. And so the whole idea where they talk about giving benefits to low-income countries, we talk about how there are other ways to bring vaccines and to bring healthcare to other nations rather than simply having to basically treat these people as lab rats. And so instead of focusing on this issue, which the opposition spends a lot of time on, what we should really be thinking about is who we are valuing when we are going through these trials. And so furthermore, they talk about how in their first contention, they lack evidence when they're actually talking about building this infrastructure and building access to healthcare. They don't give any legitimate evidence of this working, whereas we give testimonials from professionals, from professors in this field who would clearly know what they're talking about here. And furthermore, in their second contention about local healthcare infrastructure, once again, this is pretty non-unique because the gov world is not necessarily in favor of this inequality, and there are other ways to deal with this. So when they talk about how some developing nations are actively trying to attract clinical research, they once again provide no evidence. There is no data that this leads to better health outcomes in these countries. And so even though they may make these claims, when they don't substantiate them with evidence, judges, you cannot trust it. Then on their third contention of in regards to the effectiveness of trials, first of all, we gave a testimony from a medical professor at the University of Montreal that deregulation is legitimately a problem that legitimately impacts the effectiveness of these trials. Furthermore, this is a turn because these can be actually less effective since populations are very different and they're exposed to different factors than those in these wealthy Western nations, in the G20 nations that we're talking about in this debate. Also, ICH defines ethnic factors as arising from two sources, extrinsic and intrinsic. And extrinsic factors are those with the environment, intrinsic are for identifying a population. Basically, what we're saying here is that there's a difference between the tested population and the one where it's implemented. So that can even create even more problems in terms of the effectiveness of a vaccine. Thank you.
I'm not able to hear. Am I the only one?
No, I can't hear either, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me
Oh.
Yeah, a little bit, but you're cutting out.
now? How about now?
Yes.
Hold on.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Sorry, I have a microphone on my headphones, and it was just like pulled at just that
No
little bit.
problem. No problem.
All right. As a brief off-time roadmap, I'm just going to go right down the flow, first addressing my opponent's case, then getting into my own. Starting my time now with a discussion of this issue of the framework. The only real thing they have on their side is ethics. So if we can prove that A, like ethics isn't a valuable framework to evaluate this debate, or B, we're the more ethical side, we win this debate. First, they evaluate this issue. So first, they clarify that we want to like sort of decolonize debate and focus it away like from this like Western ideology. And then they say that and then they like proceed to argue this like all these issues of consent. Consent is inherently a Western idea. Lolo tells you that this like inherently comes from ideas of individualism, whereas we have like yes, this issue of informed consent. While like there are Eastern ideologies that like focus away from this idea of informed consent. Informed consent cannot be a valuable metric for them to evaluate this debate on because it's an inherently Western thing. Like especially if they're going to like specify that we're like decolonizing this debate, they automatically lose. But just refuting the rest of this because it's really the entirety of their case. So let's clarify what this is about. But first, I'll take your POI.
Wait, where in my framework do I like say that like it needs to be valuing like informed consent? I think I mentioned that like 1 point lower as like one potential concern with the regulations, but that's not my framework.
All right, thank you. So, like you're saying, well, you're evaluating this on ethics, and the main reason that you say it's not ethical is because it's not informed consent. So now I'm going to like continue to address this point. So now let's get into this point about like birth defects and like injecting babies with salt water. I want to be really clear here. It's not like on either side, you don't have some sort of birth defects or you don't have some sort of side effects on trials. It's just a fact of trials that there are going to be drugs that don't work, there are going to be side effects. They still have to accept that on their sides. The difference is that it's happening in richer countries. Now, this doesn't mean that like it's better that it's happening in poor countries, but the difference is there are going to be like harms no matter what. That's something that we have to accept. That's something that they can't mitigate for. Again, we're not saying that it's better that like these birth defects are happening in poor countries. What we do think that it's better is that we're providing like unique access to healthcare services. That's something that they completely drop on their side. On their side, they do not have any access to healthcare services. If we wanted to have a debate about like bringing access to the services, like if they wanted to include something in their plan about like providing access, that would be non-unique. But the way that you have to evaluate this is at face level. And at face level, we are providing services that you just would not get otherwise. Moving on to their case. So just, yeah, again, addressing this issue about exploitation of these nations. So first, like exploitation is like a uniquely like Western idea because it focuses on informed consent and it focuses on the individual. So first of all, we just don't think this is a value that should be evaluated at all. But second of all, we're saving relatively more lives. Like because like exploitation is such like a more it's such like a like subjective thing to evaluate. The way that we really have to boil this down is to look at what do humans physiologically need. In these nations, they do not have access to healthcare. We give them access to healthcare. For this example of salt water, like how they're injecting babies with salt water. So I really want to be like there's this very interesting contradiction that they do, which is where they're talking about this control group. They're saying we're withholding access to these people, like we're saving them from life-saving like we're not giving them life-saving vaccines. And then they say, but the people who do get these vaccines, when they are given these vaccines, like they're always very harmful and there are like horrible side effects. So like there's this contradiction that they have to make pieces on their side that they never really do. But to be very clear, like on their side, like both groups of infants, the ones who got salt water and like got vaccines, if that trial weren't happening, then all of those infants would have died anyway because they needed healthcare and they did not get any sort of healthcare anyway. We believe that whichever side saves more lives, which is like an a priori a pure moral good. Whoever saves more lives should win this debate. Because again, like evaluating morality is just such a difficult thing to do. And like again, like even if we are to say that we're evaluating morality, like the group whoever saves the most lives does this. So yeah, and again, like on this issue of like the German birth defects. So first of all, like there are going to be birth defects on both sides, but on our side, there are unique benefits. And again, like in the case of Germany, that's like a T20 nation, and so like first of all, wouldn't even be relevant to this debate. But even if it wasn't, even as an example from another country, we still win it. Their second argument is basically the same thing as their first. They're saying it raises ethical challenges to informed consent, which sort of like contributes back to their whole like ethical framework thing. But on their side, like it's this whole thing about informed consent, which is a Western individualism. We bring you that example of this Yale professor who's saying this. Okay, now getting into my own case. So first we're saying that we benefit patients in low and middle income countries. And I sort of build this up throughout my own contention, but I just like to address it one more time so it's on the flow. So they're saying that like the issue isn't about lack of vaccines in other countries, it's about saving lives. Well, I think it's absolutely about providing these vaccines in other countries because on their side they just simply don't get it. But moving into our side, why it's uniquely better. So here's where we not only so yes, there are going to be birth defects on our side. Here's why, besides providing this life-saving healthcare, which is a huge thing, we still win this debate because we uniquely help local healthcare. The unique thing about going into these nations and having these clinical trials is that you have these like hospitals that prop up. You have people who are on the ground because when they administer these clinical trials, you do have to have some sort of like system or hospital built up, and you do have some medical professionals from that nation who are helping conduct the trial. As a result, you get a lot more medical training. You will get a lot more funding into things like hospitals. You actually have this infrastructure that is built up. This is something unique that you get on our side. We uniquely help these nations. Even if you don't get these vaccines, like for the long term, you get these infrastructure systems, which are much more long term. And this is cited from research by Ketrin Weigman, who's a professor on this issue. Again, like on their side, they do not provide you with this helping local healthcare. This is something that you uniquely get from setting up these things. Now, getting into the third point, which they don't fully address, is about why it's important to do these in like low or middle income nations. The main thing here is that when you're conducting these trials in a low or middle income nation, the alternative is that you're doing it in a high income nation. And within the high income nation, it ends up being the lower bracket of people who are doing this anyway. So what does this mean? It means you have a much smaller subset of the population that's actually participating in these trials. This means that when you're testing medication for much more rare diseases, you don't get as many people who are participating in the trial. The unique thing about having a much larger subset of the population participating in these trials, because they're willing to participate in these trials, is you get more people, you get more accurate results. So on our side, we bring you more accuracy and we bring you more administration. Finally, on this issue of morality, to clarify just one more time, there are extreme cultural differences. And on this issue of like setting up these guidelines, so there are a lot of a lot of global organizations who are put in place, like the Declaration of Helsinki by the World Medical Association and the International Organization for Medical Sciences. And they never address how doctors are still going to follow Western moral values that are outlined by global organizations. And for these reasons, we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Awesome. I'm just going to take a sip of water. Okay. Pulling up my timer. Okay, I'm going to begin with a quick off-time roadmap. I am going to run through 3 voter issues in this round, and throughout that, I'll be doing some impact calculus. All right, so I will begin my time now. Hello, judges. It is Lola again, and I'm proud to continue opposing the motion that this House believes that clinical trials for drugs and vaccines that are expected to be primarily used in wealthy countries should occur in wealthy countries. So let's dive into the voter issues here, right? The first voter issue is about morality. In the government's second contention, they are focusing on the idea of informed consent, right? And in response, we explain explain how the concepts of individualism that actually lead to this idea of prioritizing informed consent are from Western philosophies. And however, in Eastern philosophies, community and family decisions are often prioritized. So if in this round we want to avoid infringing on other cultures and livelihoods, we cannot operate only within this Western moral framework, right? So when we're so that also affects the framework that they gave in this round. So then counter-wise, we gave like trying to find net benefits, right? So when we're looking for how we're going to get the most benefits for the most people, we are able to not only save more lives, but we are not further infringing on these other cultures. Okay, and then in addition, even if you don't buy this, that we should not be operating underneath this solely Western framework, we do mention that there are Western moral frameworks that are given to doctors through these worldwide organizations. This was never responded to by the government, therefore this flows through. So underneath this voter issue of morality, we win not only just on the flow, but also in terms of the argumentation about Eurocentralizing philosophy. All right, so now let's hop into the second voter issue here about saving lives. Okay, so Judge, this is a very important voter issue to look at. Clearly, if we're trying to think about like getting the most good for the most people, we want to see which side is actually going to be saving more lives. So let's look at the world of the government, right? What they're telling us is that there's a risk of side effects, right? That's what they're arguing is going to cause lives to be put in danger, okay? But in either world, there is this risk. This is completely non-unique. I'm going to stress it again. This is completely non-unique. However, on side opposition, what we give you is that we there's a possibility to continuing these trials, we have the possibility of giving people who otherwise have zero access to healthcare some access. We can build up infrastructure. We can also have more accurate and efficiently collected data that helps everyone. That point was also dropped from the government side. They did not address the fact that we were about like the sample size of people in these other nations is actually going to be larger, people who are willing but also suitable for the research. So judges, looking at the probability of our impacts happening is crucial here because we were actually the only ones that have any type of impact that could possibly happen. And we did not get enough reputation from the government side proving how they are apparently so improbable. All right, so now if we're diving into the third voter issue in this round, when we're looking at oh, sorry, you know what? I only have 2 voter issues, which means that we're going into some impact calculus. All right, so if we're doing some impact calculus, what we see here is not only is side opposition the only side that's giving you any possible impacts at all, but on side government, all of their impacts are completely non-unique. Yet, we give you a way to solve for the harms that they give us, and I have proven are non-unique. So only on side opposition do we have this possibility of saving lives, but we also have this way of trying to not infringe further on the cultural and philosophical ideas of these other nations. So overall, judges, as you are all rational individuals, just as this house is, we need to look at this round and think, what do we believe is the most important thing to prioritize, right? We want to make sure that we are not pushing our Western ideas onto other nations. And in general, we are also wanting to prioritize saving lives. And only has side opposition giving you any way to operate underneath achieving those goals. So for all those reasons and more, I strongly urge an opposition ballot in this round.
All right, so my order is I'm just gonna go an overview briefly on framework, and then I'm gonna go through some key voters. So if everyone's ready, I shall begin. So first on just a little overview, the idea that basically the way my opponents have framed that giving clinical trials to underprivileged nations is just giving them healthcare is incredibly like a privileged way of looking at it. It's not sufficient just to say that we are giving them healthcare when we're doing or performing trials on them that can be disastrous to their health and have no proven data. The healthcare is what happens after they go through the trials and they get the medicine afterwards. They give no data to actually prove that these things increase these people's lives. They give no data that it increases basically their healthcare abilities or their health overall. So keep that in mind as we go throughout the round. So moving on to framework now. First off, my opponents brought up the whole framework of it's about like most amount of lives. They brought that up in their rebuttal speech. So they didn't offer a framework originally. So it's not really fair to do this. But again, we also do care about lives. We care about the material oppression of people, but we want to frame it specifically in the countries that are being most affected by this issue. And as we have stated, issues that are apparent to underprivileged nations' health is much greater in the government's world and in the opposition world compared to the government world. So therefore, either whichever framework, we will still win very easily. So moving on to the key voters in this round. The first key voter is that my opponents completely dropped the turn on their contention regarding efficacy. My partner made it very clear that there are extrinsic and intrinsic factors defined by the ICH that lead to a population being incredibly different, which disrupts testing capabilities, and thus performing tests in other populations compared to the populations in which the drugs will be mainly used will make them less useful, since the testing is massively disrupted. Therefore, my opponents just completely cold conceded this, and this just completely turns the argument and shows that they're going to make drugs worse across the entire world the more you increase this. So not only are they harming the poor citizens who live in these nations, but they're also harming the medical industry overall. This was not conceded, and it's a very important. This was not addressed, and it's a very important argument throughout the round. Moving on to the next key voter in this round, and this is going to be the actual health of the people in these countries. So there's been a lot of back and forth over whether it helps them or not. My opponents say it's the only way for them to get healthcare, people in developed nations to get healthcare, is through obtaining essentially these clinical trials. And okay, this is not true. By making this argument, you're essentially justifying the lack of healthcare in these countries. You are saying, they're getting healthcare. We're giving them healthcare. It makes it sound like we're justifying our lack of giving them healthcare and instead performing clinical trials on them. Rhetoric like that leads to Westerners thinking it's okay to just test on these countries and then not give them the drugs, or not make it affordable to give them the drugs afterwards. My partner has extended the evidence that says that only 8% of the drugs tested in these nations become available afterwards. Thus, I think it's really unlikely to assume that these populations' health are benefited at all. And on the contrary, they are the ones who have to go through the potentially devastating health risks of these trials, which can cause deformities, can cause death, can cause all sorts of massive issues, especially when, as we go into our next voter, the regulations are simply not there. My opponents gives that there are regulations, which of course do exist. However, even though the regulations exist, we still tell you that there's a very large percentage of malpractice within the FDA studies in these nations, which was just not responded to. Even if the regulations do exist, they have not made it so that these trials are not effective. There's just a lack of oversight. Although we have regulations are much easier to be monitored and adhered to when they're in the domestic country. But once the pharmaceutical companies go abroad, they're much less likely, just empirically, to follow these regulations. And as a result, their clinical trials are more abusive and even more damaging than they would be if they were done domestically. Overall, a little bit of just a simple analysis of the round, it comes down to a very simple concept. My opponents say, well, the harm is happening in either situation. What's the difference? And I'll explain the difference overall, which is the real crux of this round. The difference is that when a developing nation is taking the risk of having its population being subjected to a test for a drug that is not already approved, it means that there is some risk involved. And this risk is generally, the whole concept of a clinical trial is this risk is rewarded by access to the drug. But when no such access exists, it results in their populations just having to absorb the harm without actually improving their medical infrastructure at all. And this is a really just problematic way of looking at healthcare. And the idea that we're just being sufficient in this is a very Western-centric idea. And it overall is very much more beneficial to stop these trials unless we're going to give them access to the drugs. Thank you.
All right.
All set?
Yeah, I'm all set. Thanks. I
Okay.
don't know what happened.
No, all good. Do you want to go first?
Well, did you see it? I think it's a split decision.
Oh, is it a split decision? Okay. Well, yeah. Then it doesn't really matter who goes first. I tend to be a bit long-winded, so I don't want to take up too much time. So why don't you go first, and that'll force me to.
I'll go. I'll go first. And guys, I have my judge paradigm that I created, and I'm not like as technical of a debater or a judge. I like to kind of sit back and kind of listen to the arguments and see how I'm persuaded by the end. I took lots of notes. You guys did a great job of having just a wonderful debate that really made me think as to who I thought, won the debate. at the end of the day, though, I decided with a Gov team. And I actually think the first Gov member did an excellent job of spelling out the debate. Lola, awesome job in your first op. So it really made me think. And by the end, though, you know, when I sat back to kind of think about where I was persuaded, I was more persuaded on the margin by the Gov team. And let me just take my and for me, I just felt that I was very much persuaded that the negatives associated with the testing of the drugs in the developing countries outweighed the benefits, and that the argument presented by OP that the developing countries would benefit from the increased healthcare and infrastructure, I thought that was really good and had me going, but ultimately it was less persuasive to me than the evidence that the Gov had cited about the risks associated with the trials, and ultimately the fact that, you know, the developing countries and the population does not get the benefits or of those drugs afterwards. So I do think that additional evidence from OP would have been very helpful about and examples of the healthcare improving in those countries that do the trials. It was just lacking on some extra examples and evidence for me to be persuaded that the benefits there outweighed the negatives. I also found the arguments from the government team compelling about deregulation and oversight of the trials in those developing countries, and, you know, whether or not the best results were going to be beginning. I would say that the argument about the Western philosophy, I thought was just, again, you guys, this might be a debate point that happens quite often, but I just admire all of you for really kind of thinking about not imposing sort of Western values elsewhere, et cetera. At the same time, though, it did not persuade me in terms of, you know, the idea of consent and what happens in the local population, but I very much appreciated the argument. So, you know, for all those reasons, it was at the margin, and I would say that the first Gov was able to kind of persuade me and bring it home at the end. So that's what I decided.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry if you guys heard my cat meowing in the background. So as you know, this was a split decision. I went with the op. What's interesting is that, Kara, you and I appeared to vote on similar issues, but I agree with you because it was kind of on the margin. I just came out slightly on the other side. And I know Kara also said she's not like a super kind of technical debating judge. I debated for a while, so if you want technical, I can give you technical. I think the main challenge for me in judging this round was that it kind of became a standard utilitarianism versus kind of categorical imperative deontology round. In the sense that OP wanted to have a debate about who saves more lives, and Gov wanted to have a debate about kind of the ethics of using impoverished people as means to an end. The difficulty, though, is that neither side really justifies to me why their moral framing of the round is superior. Basically, the entire ethical debate devolves into kind of dueling assertions. One side says, this is the moral framework we should use. The other side says, this is the moral framework we should use. And I don't have a mechanism for deciding which of those is right. And the reason that this round is chosen is because those two propositions do kind of clash against each other. And it's kind of incumbent on the debaters to try to, you know, interrogate the reasoning behind each of them and figure out which one they find more persuasive. The problem with me, though, is, you know, Gov wants to talk about this individual rights argument, but I don't hear analysis on, okay, at a certain point, though, that's going to bump up against broader societal benefit. How do I weigh that? Should we always avoid using people as a means to an end? Meanwhile, OP wants to frame Gov's argument as kind of a Western construction, which is true, but it doesn't really refute it. I mean, OP's essentially making utilitarian argument, and that's also a Western construction. So I need a little bit more on the fact that an idea emerges from Western philosophy is, while true, and I think an important thing to keep in mind, it doesn't meaningfully demonstrate to me that it's not a perspective that I should consider and that I should weigh in the round. So as a result of that, I kind of, like Kara, move away from just evaluating on the ethical frameworks, and I move to who do I think gets more solvency. So in effect, I'm kind of evaluating on OP's ground. And what I end up with is I do think that the op arguments about building infrastructure, creating access to healthcare, I think those flow through nicely. I think that the arguments about regulation in those countries are fair, but I think they're mitigated by ops responses that you're still able to get better representative sample sizes, treat certain diseases by sampling population members from developing countries that you can't sample from developed countries. But it's I agree with Kara. It's a very marginal vote. It was not an easy vote for me to make. The only other thing I'll say is, and this is take this with a grain of salt because this kind of is based on my background and the type of debate that I did. I personally don't find kind of citations to specific authority to be persuasive. So it's not persuasive to me to say a Yale professor said this. The Yale professor could be wrong. I want to hear you tell me what the reasoning is and why that argument's correct. It's not enough just to say someone else that's smart said this. That you guys are super smart. I want you guys to tell me why I should believe it, not that a Yale professor told me I should believe it. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying don't pull in evidence and don't pull in authority, but be mindful about how you use it and make sure that the arguments that you're making are truly yours and not just kind of arguments that you're expecting me to accept because someone else who's super smart made them. Like, you guys are smart enough. You don't need any help. That's kind of where I am. I know that the next round's going to start really soon, but if you have any questions, feel free to stick around. But really good round. Thank you.
Thank you. Good job, guys. Good luck in your round.
Thank you. Good round, guys.
Good luck.
Thanks.